Have you ever seen a single act of kindness spark a movement that changed lives? She handed coffee to the man with the dog, right in front of the inspector. Her boss didn't raise his voice. He didn't even look angry, just cold. Final. You're done here, Grace. 6 years of loyalty erased in a single sentence. She didn't cry, just untied her apron, hands shaking, and walked out. Not because she broke a rule, but because she stood up for a veteran and his service dog. What Grace didn't know was that someone filmed the whole thing. And before the cafe's morning rush was over, the ground began to shake. 4 military Humvees rolled into the lot. Out stepped a Marine colonel in full dress blues, a man who once owed his life to the very veteran she protected. And in that moment, everything changed. Grace Donnelly wasn't the type of woman people noticed first, but she was the one they remembered longest. At 35, she managed the Mason Muggs Café, tucked on the edge of downtown Mason, Georgia, just a 15-minute drive from Fort Gringanger, one of the largest Marine installations in the Southeast. The town itself was like something out of a Norman Rockwell painting: oak-lined sidewalks, American flags on every third porch, and a hardware store that hadn't changed its paint color since the Reagan administration. But inside the café, things felt different, warmer, more human. Grace made sure of that. She didn't run the café like a business. She ran it like a second home. The kind of place where someone could walk in after a long day or a long deployment and feel human again. The coffee wasn't anything fancy. No espresso martinis or complicated froth art. Just strong, brewed, hot refills, and handwritten notes stuck to the bulletin board behind the counter. But what set the Mason Muggs apart wasn't the coffee. It was Grace. She remembered names, birthdays, blackout dates for deployment. She knew who liked their eggs over hard and who hadn't touched coffee since they got back from Iraq. She made space for silence, especially the kind that came from veterans who carried more than just physical scars. And every Wednesday at 9 a.m. sharp, she hosted what had quietly become a town tradition, Heroes Hour. Can you imagine the courage it takes to stand up for what's right, even when it costs you everything? It started with just 3 of them. Her father-in-law, Ben Donnelly, a retired Marine Corps drill instructor. Ralph, a Vietnam vet who rarely spoke but never missed a week. And Louisa, a former Army nurse with a laugh that echoed like wind chimes. Over time, the circle grew. Desert Storm, Iraq, Afghanistan. Veterans from every era found their way to her café, drawn less by the menu and more by the woman who ran it. Grace would always say the same thing before starting: this is a place to be seen, not fixed, to sit, not perform. And they'd nod, shoulders easing as they sipped coffee and swapped stories. Some funny, some heavy, and some too painful to tell with words. She never spoke much about her own story, but everyone in town knew the outline. Her husband, Staff Sergeant Michael Donnelly, was killed in action 6 years earlier in Helmand Province, Afghanistan. His photograph hung on the wall above the register, not in uniform, but in jeans and a flannel, holding a mug of coffee outside the cafe's front door. It was taken 2 weeks before his final deployment. He never came home. Grace never remarried, never even hinted at it. She'd poured her grief into the cafe, not to escape it, but to build something out of it, something that mattered. People loved her for it, but more than that, they respected her. Veterans called her ma'am without irony. Teens held the door for her without being told. Even the mayor stopped by once a month just to thank her for holding the town together better than most institutions. But for Grace, it was never about recognition. It was about the mission. The quiet one, the one that didn't come with medals, but mattered just as much. Every time she poured a cup of coffee for a vet too anxious to sit in a crowded room. Every time she walked out from behind the counter to check if someone was okay after staring too long out the window. Every time she let a dog curl up under a table without asking questions. It wasn't a rule book she followed. It was instinct. It was love. And that Wednesday morning, the one where everything changed, started like all the others. The bell over the door jingled softly. The regulars filed in. Coffee brewed. The cafe filled with quiet chatter, laughter, and the warm hum of belonging. Grace didn't know it yet, but by the end of the day, that little corner cafe would become the center of a storm that would echo all the way to Washington. And it would all begin with a man, a dog, and a woman who refused to back down. It was a crisp Wednesday morning, the kind of morning where sunlight looked cooler than it felt, and steam rose gently from every cup like little ghosts. Grace was behind the counter, sleeves rolled, hair pinned back, greeting every familiar face with that same nod, quiet but warm. She had already brewed the first pot of dark roast for Hero's Hour and was setting out the stack of ceramic mugs she saved just for the veterans. Then the door opened again, and Ray McMillan stepped in with Shadow by his side. Ray was one of the newer faces, late 50s, ex-Marine Corps recon. He didn't talk much and he never stayed long, but he came. That meant something. Shadow, his black lab German Shepherd mix, was never more than a few inches from his heel. The dog wore a bright red vest with bold white lettering, service dog. Do not pet. Grace gave Ray a little wave. Table by the windows, open, she said, smiling. He nodded, murmured a thanks, and guided Shadow to the far corner. Then the air shifted. The front door swung open with a brisk whoosh, and in walked a man in a navy blazer, neatly pressed slacks, and an expression that seemed allergic to joy. He carried a clipboard like it was a badge of honor. His name tag read, Logan Prescott, State Health Inspector. Grace hadn't been expecting a visit. She greeted him politely. Can I help you find something? She asked. An inspection, he said flatly. Unannounced. He moved through the space with surgical detachment, tapping on metal surfaces, checking labels, pulling open refrigerator doors. And then he saw the dog. He stopped mid-step like he'd walked into a wall. That animal, he said loudly, pointing toward Shadow, is in violation of state health code. No animals permitted where food is served. Heads turned. Conversations went quiet. Grace stepped out from behind the counter, careful not to raise her voice. He's a registered service dog, she said calmly. ADA law permits his presence here. Prescott frowned, scanning the room like he was looking for backup. I don't care what vest he's wearing, he snapped. Animals carry dander, saliva, hair. This is a food hazard. Unless you want this cafe shut down, that dog goes. Ray stiffened in his chair, his hand gripping the coffee cup like it might fall. Shadow didn't move. He simply looked up at Ray and waited. The room fell into silence. Grace took a slow breath and said the words she knew she couldn't take back. I won't ask a veteran to leave, and I won't ask his service dog to leave either. You're welcome to write your report, but you'll do it knowing you tried to humiliate a man who served this country in front of the very people he served to protect. Prescott's jaw clenched. From across the cafe, someone muttered, damn right. But it didn't matter because standing in the doorway now was another figure, Deborah Lyle, regional manager for the Mason Muggs parent company. Apparently, she'd arrived early for a routine check-in, just in time to see it all. Her eyes were wide, her tone was ice. Grace Donnelly, she said. You've just violated a direct health compliance policy in front of a state inspector. Pack your things. You're terminated. Gasps rang out. A spoon clattered to the floor. Ray stood halfway, shocked. Grace didn't move. Not at first. Then she looked around the cafe. She looked at Ray, at Shadow, at the small chalkboard on the wall that said, Hero's Hour today. Free coffee for vets. And she smiled, just barely. She untied her apron with trembling fingers, folded it, and placed it on the counter. Then she turned to Elena, the young barista by the espresso machine, and whispered, make sure Ray gets his refill. She walked out the side door into the morning sunlight as the cafe stood frozen behind her. No one followed, but someone pressed record, and somewhere out in the ether of phones, social media, and invisible networks, a story had just been captured. A quiet act of defiance, a line drawn. A woman fired not because she broke a rule, but because she refused to break her soul. And far away in an office filled with military photos and brass nameplates, Colonel Richard Gaines got a phone call he wouldn't ignore. For 35 minutes, the Mason Muggs was silent. Customers whispered. Some left their coffee half drunk. Others sat still, glancing out the window like the wind itself might carry in an explanation. But Elena, the young barista Grace had trained, stayed at her post. Her hands trembled slightly as she poured Ray's second cup. "I didn't know what to say," she would later admit, "but I knew if I left that station, I'd be letting her down." Ray sat quietly at his table. He hadn't touched his cup since Grace left. Shadow lay curled at his feet, ears twitching, but still, as if he sensed that something had broken in the room. And then it began. A low rumble, barely audible at first, like distant thunder rolling across Georgia hills. Chairs wobbled. Coffee rippled. The cafe's windows began to hum. Customers stood and looked out. From the east end of Main Street, through the morning mist and maple-lined sidewalks, came 4 military Humvees, tires growling against pavement. Their lights cut through the haze like searchbeams. The vehicles pulled into the lot in a slow, deliberate line, blocking the cafe's front. Doors opened in unison, and out stepped Colonel Richard Gaines, decorated, composed, in full Marine Corps dress blues, gold buttons, polished white gloves in hand, his ribbons numerous, his expression impenetrable. Behind him, 24 Marines followed in formation, their uniforms sharp, their presence unmistakable. They stood at attention on the sidewalk outside the cafe. Inside, no one moved. The inspector, Logan Prescott, stood frozen near the pastry case. His clipboard lowered, forgotten. Deborah Lyle, the regional manager, had paled 2 shades and stepped back from the counter like it might burn her. The cafe's bell jingled once, and Colonel Gaines entered alone. His boots struck the floor hard, slow, echoing like a drum roll through the silence. He stopped in the center of the cafe, glancing once at Elena, who swallowed hard, then at Ray, who had slowly stood up. Their eyes met. Ray nodded quietly. The colonel returned it with something even deeper, a salute, and that's when Prescott stammered. I didn't know he was." The colonel didn't raise his voice. "You don't need to know who someone is to treat them with basic dignity." He turned to Elena. "Is Grace Donnelly here?" Elena shook her head. She was fired for standing up for Mr. McMillan and Shadow. Colonel Gaines turned, his jaw tightening. That woman once served the families of this base better than most agencies combined. She gave my men a place to breathe when they came home with no words, and she treated a decorated Marine with the respect this nation promised him and forgot. Ray cleared his throat, speaking for the first time. "She didn't ask questions," he said quietly. "She didn't flinch when I walked in with a dog. She just poured the coffee and gave me a place to sit. That was the first time in a long time I felt like a person again." A tear slipped down a woman's cheek near the register. Colonel Gaines nodded, then turned to the Marines waiting outside. He stepped toward the door, and with a simple motion, he raised his hand in signal. They filed in, orderly, silent, reverent. 2 Marines moved behind the counter and removed the corporate logo from the wall, folding the vinyl panel like a flag. Another replaced the chalkboard sign with a new one brought from their vehicle. It read in bold, white, hand-painted letters, "Welcome to Grace's house, where honor is served daily." When Deborah Lyle tried to interject, Colonel Gaines looked at her only once. "You've made your decision," he said. "Now we'll make ours." Then he stepped outside, phone in hand. A moment later, Elena's phone buzzed. She looked down, confused. "It's a direct message from Fort Granger," she said. "They've requested Grace report to base headquarters today." Ray let out a slow breath, eyes wide. Shadow stood. And in the cafe that once held coffee and comfort, something entirely new was brewing, a reckoning. Grace sat in her truck on the edge of her driveway, keys in hand, but engine off. She'd been sitting there for 15 minutes. Still in her cafe clothes, coffee-stained jeans, her favorite blue flannel, and shoes that had seen more spilled espresso than she cared to count. Grace stared out at the road, replaying the morning over and over again. Fired in front of customers for doing the right thing. And now, a message from the base. Colonel Gaines would like to meet at Fort Granger headquarters today. She didn't know what that meant. She didn't know if it was a good thing, but somehow deep down, she felt the shift. Something larger than her life at the Mason Mugs had just begun. Grace took a breath, turned the ignition, and headed down the familiar road she'd driven hundreds of times before. Only this time, she wasn't going to drop off muffins or coffee canisters. This time, she was going through the gates, Fort Granger stood like a city of disciplined, orderly roads, flag-lined avenues, the sound of cadence calls echoing in the background. Grace had been there as a military wife before, but now, walking into the main administration building, she felt like an outsider again. Colonel Richard Gaines met her at the door. He wasn't in dress blues now, just a clean, khaki uniform and a calm presence that could command a room with a glance. "Grace," he said, extending his hand. "Thank you for coming." She shook it, firm but unsure. "Still not entirely sure why I'm here." "Let me show you something." He led her down a hallway lined with portraits of past commanders, training maps, and commendation plaques. They stopped in front of a door labeled Veteran Transition and Wellness Initiative. Inside, the room was filled with folding chairs, whiteboards, and boxes of unused supplies. A few young staffers moved quietly in the corner, setting up therapy mats and moving donated equipment. "This is a pilot program," he explained. "We've been trying to get it off the ground for 2 years. Trouble is, it's hard to find someone who understands vets, not just from paperwork, but from the inside." Grace folded her arms. "I'm not a therapist. I don't have a degree in social work." "No," he said. "But you built a place where men and women with invisible wounds came to heal. You did more with coffee and kindness than some programs do with $1 million budget." She didn't answer right away. Colonel Gaines stepped closer, his tone softening. "You created a sanctuary without realizing it. What you did in that cafe, that was leadership. That was service." Then from the back room, a voice called out, "Is that her?" A young woman stepped out, mid-20s, long sleeves covering burn scars along her arms and jaw. Her name tag read Tiffany Rios. She walked slowly, a golden retriever puppy beside her, wearing a red vest marked in training. "Hi," she said shyly. "I just wanted to say I saw the video of you and the dog and the guy. I haven't been to a coffee shop since I came home, but I think I could sit in a place you run." Grace blinked. The air in her chest shifted. Colonel Gaines smiled. "We'd like to offer you a position, not as a figurehead, not as a name on a brochure, but as the director of this center." Grace exhaled. "You're serious?" "As a heart attack," he said. "You'd run the programs, build the space, shape the culture. You already know what works. Community, routine, respect." She looked at Tiffany, now kneeling with her dog. She thought of Ray, of Shadow, of the dozens of men and women who'd found their way into the Mason mugs, not for lattes, but for peace. And suddenly she knew. "I'll do it," she said quietly. The colonel nodded once. "Then let's get to work." That night, Grace stood alone in what would soon be the new heart of Fort Granger's outreach efforts. The walls were bare, the floors still scuffed, but the air felt full of something sacred. She reached into her bag and took out an old photo. Michael, her husband, sitting outside the cafe, his boots up, smiling at her. She pinned it to the wall. No plaque, no frame, just memory and mission. Word spread faster than she imagined. By the end of the week, the Veteran Transition and Wellness Center at Fort Granger wasn't just another military initiative. It had become something alive. Veterans who hadn't stepped foot on base in years showed up. Young soldiers returned with hesitant spouses. Even the local newspaper, the Mason Herald, ran a full-page spread. From Café to Command, how Grace Donnelly is rebuilding trust one cup at a time. Grace didn't do anything flashy. She didn't bring in fancy speakers or consultants. She just did what she'd always done. She paid attention. She asked names and remembered them. She posted a whiteboard near the coffee pot that read, "Who needs a ride? Who needs a listener?" She let dogs curl up in corners of therapy rooms without a fuss. She kept that same handwritten notebook from the cafe and added new pages, one for every vet who walked through the door. Some days were quiet, some were hard, some were full of nothing but silence and refills. But something powerful was building, a space where pain wasn't hidden and healing didn't need to be loud. Ray came often now. Shadow would walk straight to his favorite corner and lie down like he'd always belonged. Tiffany Rios showed up every Tuesday. She wasn't ready to speak in groups yet, but she'd begun sketching again images of dogs, hands, and homecomings. And Elena, the young barista from the Mason Mugs, visited every Friday. She brought coffee, yes, but also laughter. And when Grace needed a second opinion on anything from wallpaper to website wording, Elena was the first to weigh in. But not everyone was thrilled. Some officials questioned why someone with no formal training was running a federal pilot program. Auditors arrived quietly, clipboards in hand, suits stiff with skepticism. They examined logs, asked probing questions, even tested the water filters on the coffee machine. At the end of their review, one inspector looked Grace dead in the eye and asked, "What certifications do you hold that qualify you to counsel veterans?" Grace didn't blink. "I don't have certifications," she said softly. "Just consistency and kindness." The inspector didn't respond, but he took notes. A week later, Grace received a formal notice. The Wellness Center was being reviewed for possible national model expansion. Colonel Gaines called it a victory. Grace just called it humbling. But even as the center grew, the Mason Mugs still tugged at her heart. One afternoon, she returned quietly, without announcement. Elena was behind the counter. "You're supposed to be famous now," she teased, sliding a mug across the counter. "I'm just here for coffee," Grace said, smiling. The cafe had changed. Photos of vets now lined the walls, Ray, Tiffany, and others. A new sign had been hung near the register. Grace's Corner, where no one sits alone. Later that day, Grace drove across town to speak at a local fundraiser for veteran families. It was a modest event, mostly older folks and kids with crayon posters. She spoke without notes. "I didn't set out to build a program," she said. "I just refused to throw out a man and his dog." The crowd fell silent, then applause. Loud, long, real. And somewhere in the back, Ray stood, his silver star pinned to his chest, and gave her a quiet salute. Back at the center that night, Grace sat alone by the wall of photos. She added one more, a picture of the cafe taken the day after the Humvees came, people standing shoulder to shoulder, dogs lying under tables, coffee in every hand, no fear, no shame, just connection. Above it, she taped a small card that read, "Legacy isn't what we build for ourselves. It's what we protect in others." As she turned to leave, a young veteran with nervous eyes stepped through the door. "Is this the place for, people like us?" Grace smiled gently. "No, son. This is the place for people like all of us." And just like that, her circle wasn't just full, it was open. 3 weeks after the fundraiser, a letter arrived. It came in a sealed envelope stamped with the gold emblem of the Department of Defense. Colonel Gaines handed it to Grace personally. They stood inside her office at the Wellness Center, surrounded by the quiet hum of a space still learning how to heal. He didn't say much, just, "You'll want to sit for this." She opened it slowly, the official language blurred as her eyes scanned the first line. "You are hereby nominated for the National Civilian Commendation for Distinguished Service to Veterans." She read it again. Then again. "I didn't do anything special," she whispered. Colonel Gaines chuckled. "That's exactly why you're getting it." The letter came with an invitation not just to attend a ceremony in Washington, but to speak at the National Veterans Advocacy Conference. Grace felt her knees go weak. "I'm not a public speaker." "You are now." The day she left for D.C., she packed light, just one blazer, an old watch of Michael's, and the same notebook she'd used behind the cafe counter for years. Names, birthdays, notes like "Tiffany prefers tea" and "Don't ask Ray about May 15th." That notebook had carried more weight than any resume. As she waited at the airport, she heard someone call her name. "Need a ride, Miss Donnelly?" She turned to see Ray McMillan standing tall in full dress blues, shadow comb by his side, tail gently wagging. "The base assigned me as your escort," he said with a grin. Grace laughed, half nerves, half awe. "You clean up pretty good." He smirked. "You're the one about to speak to the Pentagon." The ballroom at the conference was larger than she expected. White tablecloths, polished brass podium, cameras at every angle. Her name glowed on the screen behind her in elegant lettering. When she stepped up to the microphone, Her voice was smaller than the room, but the room leaned in. I'm not a general. I'm not a doctor. I didn't write policy. I managed a cafe near a military base. I served coffee. I listened. A pause. But in that space, I watched something sacred happen. Veterans came not for advice, but for presence. They didn't need to be fixed. They needed to be seen. People nodded. A few wiped away tears. One day I got fired for letting a man sit with his service dog. That was the moment everything changed. But the truth is, it was never about coffee. It was about dignity. Applause thundered through the hall. Ray stood in the back. He didn't cheer. He didn't clap. He just nodded like a soldier, hearing his orders finally clearly. Later that night, as the sun dipped behind the Potomac, Grace stepped outside alone. She needed air, silence. A man in a gray suit with a white beard approached. Quiet, kind eyes behind thin glasses. You don't remember me, do you? He asked. She studied his face. It stirred something. He pulled out an old photograph, grainy, faded. Her Michael and the older man in uniform outside the cafe, long before her husband's last deployment. You poured me a cup of coffee the day I got my medical discharge. You didn't say anything. You just smiled. It was the first time I felt like myself again. He held out the photo. It's yours now. She took it with trembling fingers, words caught in her throat. Back home in Mason, the town held a welcome celebration. But Grace didn't go straight there. She returned to the wellness center. It was late, quiet. A few veterans still lingered near the fire pit. She walked to the wall of photos, reached into her bag, and added one more, a snapshot of the conference crowd giving her a standing ovation. Beside it, she taped the old cafe photo, the one with Michael and the soldier from long ago. And below them, she wrote a simple line, "Honor grows where kindness is consistent." As she turned to leave, a young veteran with nervous eyes stepped through the door. Is this the place for, people like us? Grace smiled gently. No, son. This is the place for people like all of us. And just like that, her circle wasn't just full, it was open. In a world that moves faster every day, it's easy to overlook the quiet moments, the soft-spoken waitress, the trembling veteran, the wag of a service dog's tail. But sometimes those moments are the ones that shape us. Grace Donnelly didn't wear a uniform. She didn't hold rank, but she upheld something sacred, dignity. And in doing so, she reminded us all that honor isn't earned once, it's defended daily. What happened at that small cafe in Mason, Georgia,